All right. Joining me for the first episode of this year is Kristy Perano. Welcome back to the show, Kristy.
Well, thanks for having me.
Yeah, and for those who are noticing, this is very new quarters. I'm actually recording this from my wife's office, in it, and yeah, just it's a bit of a new change for me. So yeah, it's I'm also down here in Atlanta, so it's just a lot warmer than my hometown. Um, so let's start with our first segment, cobbled together. What has there's been a lot happening in Afghanistan, particularly when it comes to women's rights. Is that right, Kristy?
Yeah, so the Taliban has, I, well, I think some people might have seen some of the news articles on this, but um, Taliban had for a long time not been allowing like secondary school. So like they would only allow girls to go to primary school, and then after about age 12, it's like, well, you should just be getting married and having kids at this point. No need to go to school. But then they still did have some universities where they had like gender segregated classes. And of course, in the Doha Accords a couple of years ago, they had said, oh, women can get educated and all this stuff. Well, I mean, as many of us expected, they didn't mean what they said. So then they just recently said, well, actually, they're not, even if gender segregated, they're not going to allow any education past like age 12. So
And
women,
and who knows how long they're going to allow that for?
right? Yeah. Um, so they've decided that women cannot go to university. There'll be no high school, and I mean, despite their promises to contrary, despite efforts to segregate by gender, which was supposedly one of the things they were concerned about, at that's all been to no avail. There have been some countries that have stepped up to say, like, there was some announcement, I think today or yesterday, that Germany was going to be helping fund scholarships for Afghan women to like finish their bachelor's degrees in neighboring countries. But then a lot of neighboring countries have not been real welcoming to Afghans. There have been a few Afghan scholars that have been able to go on student visas to the US or Europe or something. But for the most part, those student visas are very discretionary, and like the US doesn't want to award a student visa unless the student can demonstrate that they plan on going back to typically their home country, or at least leave the country when they finish their degree. And so now they say, oh, well, gee, Afghanistan's such a mess. You're obviously not going home, so we're not going to let you come here, because when you come here, you're probably just going to apply for asylum.
That
So
is
it's
dumb.
yeah, so it's just like this catch 22. And a lot of this is so discretionary. Like the Biden administration really could be stepping up. They could be allowing people to parole in Afghan students, but they're not. I mean, they are trying to process the special immigrant visas, and they have increased the throughput of that. But those are very specific criteria, and only about 10% or so of those are women. Now, a lot of them are men who are married. So I mean, obviously, like, I mean, probably almost half of the people that come on special immigrant visas as either principal or dependents are women. So there are like a lot of Afghan women benefiting at least as a spouse, for any sort of visa that's being processed. But the US is really pretty much showing zero leadership in terms of like actually actually whenever they have an opportunity to exercise discretion in some way that could benefit Afghan women or Afghan scholars, they're just like, no, sorry, if you don't meet these very specific criteria for this already established program, then tough luck. So yeah, it's not something that really any country in the world has stepped up very much, including the US. I think Canada has, they took in a few thousand like human rights activists, many of which were women, but even countries that have made a big deal out of like, oh, we took a plane full of female judges, or we are taking like 5,000 human rights activists or whatever, they haven't really sustained those programs. So it's kind of been, um, oh, it happens, and then it gets filled up in a few weeks, and then it's all over. And like, there's not really a single Western country that has like really stepped up and come up with a functional program to like evaluate Afghans at risk and save those at risk. I mean, a lot of countries will claim that, but like mostly it's fairly limited to people that meet specific criteria. And there's not a single country that, if an Afghan is like educated and has some support and they go way to contribute back to society, there's a country that's like, okay, yeah, if we can see that this person is educated and is going to be able to support themselves and they have some support to get started, we want Afghans. It's kind of, I mean, Brazil and Germany I think have done better than a lot of other countries, but most of the world is pretty content to just be like, well, we don't want Afghans because when they come here they're going to apply for asylum, so they can all just stay there. And then of course they try to whitewash the Taliban, so it's not really that bad. And at least, and claims that there's no civil war anymore because we just have the Taliban like indiscriminately murdering people, but it's technically not a civil war because it's like the other side is not good enough at defending themselves to be able to qualify as a civil war, so they're just kind of sitting ducks. But so yeah, technically they can claim it's not a civil war, but it's really just because the other side is so defenseless that they can't even defend themselves when the Taliban decides to arrest and murder the people they don't like.
You know those lollipops that are called dum-dums? That is what the members of the governments in the West remind me of. They're dum-dums. Like, let's suggest the fact that we don't want you to come because you're going to apply for asylum. Yeah, they're going to apply for asylum because they have a good reason to. And
Yeah.
yeah, and also in terms of like the whole student visa thing, the fact that the US wants people who come to a student visa to then go back to their home countries, why aren't you trying to recruit the best and the brightest students to stay in the US? Like, I'm sure many of those Afghans would be the best and the brightest.
Yeah, and I think in reality, a lot of, I mean, I've known a lot of international students that were able to stay in the US, but they would, in order to get a visa, like they would have had to have proved that they didn't plan to stay in the US. And then, especially if they go into a STEM field and they're able to get a job, the company can sponsor an H-1B visa. So, I mean, I know a lot of them that have successfully stayed, um, but yeah, it does seem like a backwards policy. It's like, oh, we only want the best, but we want to make sure you go home when you're done.
Yeah.
But yeah, and
Um,
they really haven't done anything to accommodate Afghans, and not really being able to meet that criteria anymore.
really unfortunate. And let's move on to our next segment, Kyiv Together. And because I think there's been some action going on in Ukraine, but also on the NATO front, it sounds like Sweden is finally putting its foot down and said, "Hey, Turkey, we can't meet your demands. Your demands are unreasonable." And I think those demands specifically concern the Kurds.
Yeah, I think Turkey was trying to use this as an opportunity to blackmail Sweden. They had like specific, I think a couple of them are actually members of the parliament, Kurds that have kind of been outspoken about Kurdish issues that they were trying to blackmail Sweden to turn over. Um, and yeah, I think I think that that's another situation where the West usually fails to stand up for principles, and that they kind of, because it's like Turkey's NATO, et cetera, then Turkey kind of gets to bully everybody. And I think repeated administrations have really kind of failed to stand up to Turkey. It is likely that the Biden administration is, well, it's just pretty much guaranteed the Biden administration is working behind the scenes to try to keep Turkey from invading Syria, but they haven't stopped Turkish drone attacks. They haven't stopped Turkey from constantly threatening
Yeah.
stuff. So they've been a little better than Trump at like kind of behind the scenes to try to protect the Kurds, but it's disappointing that there's not a single country in the world that's willing to really like smack Turkey down and say, no, this
Yeah.
is ridiculous.
Yeah, and just on a brief segment called Aleppo Together, I think I've been hearing about the possibility that Turkey is going to invade northern Syria and basically just take over the place and like, just because I have to say this, these other countries around this area like Syria, they've not been great countries overall, but the Kurds have sort of been able to carve out an area for themselves, like particularly in Syria and in Iraq and in Iran more, but not so in Turkey.
Yeah, there are Kurds in Turkey, but they are constantly, I mean, they're often persecuted by the Turkish government, and like even recently they've arrested some of their leaders of their party and whatnot.
It's
So
ironic
yeah,
that
Turkey is pretty
that the
consistent
Turkish
on that.
Kurds are the ones who are treated the worst.
Yeah, I
And
mean, I would say, I think that Iraq and Syria, they've been, I mean, really just Iraq because of a weak central government. They have been able to have the like, Kurdish regions, and then in Syria, but that was really because the Kurdish groups like took over from ISIS, and they've gotten some support from the US to have sort of a functionally independent area. I don't think Kurds are treated well at all in Iran. I don't know, exactly objectively how does it compare to
right,
Turkey, but yeah, Turkey is, I think, really just because of a stronger central government. Turkey has been, more effectively able to persecute the Kurds than at the moment. It's not really that Syria, or it's not that Assad likes them. It's just that Assad has been weakened enough that they've, through some U.S. support, including I think behind the scenes, they've been able to have this like independent area. But the northern Syria is constantly under assault from Turkey, and even if it's not technically an invasion, they're still like flying drones over there and willy-nilly bombing stuff from time to time. So it is really unacceptable that Turkey's behavior there, and they've wanted since, I mean, since their 2019 invasion, Turkey has been pretty clear that they would like to just kick all the Kurds out, and then they have a lot of Arab Syrians and other refugees in Turkey that they don't really like. So Turkey's ideal is to just get rid of all the Kurds, and then they could um, just deport the Arab Syrians, and they'd have somewhere to send them. And that's kind of, I mean, they don't really phrase it as ethnic cleansing, but that's effectively the policy that they're seeking.
yeah. I want to keep hopping around though, but on the note about the Kurds, because in Iran, because I feel like they've had an opportunity the past few months, and this is what I wanted to. I've been wanting to introduce a segment for a while called Tehran Together, about the protests that have been happening in Iran. I don't know if those are still ongoing, but there were like massive protests for women's rights in Iran, like possibly bigger than what we've seen in a while, and it may have led to at least the temporary disbanding of the morality police.
Yeah, I think the protests are still going on, and I think it's been hard to figure out if the morality police are actually disbanded or at least downgraded, or if they just really did that to try to get that narrative to catch on while they weren't actually following it. It's sort of like a false flag policy kind of thing. So the protests are ongoing, even though it's not as new, and so it's not quite as interesting to the media anymore. They have executed a fair number of protesters, I think maybe 10 or 13 or something along those lines, and some of those I think have been Kurdish. Um, and yeah, I think the protests are continuing to go on in Iran, but you just don't hear quite as much about it because it's not as new as it was.
Yeah, and maybe the hope that the Ayatollahs would fall, that may have seemed to have faded now, because it seems like they're still entrenched.
Yeah, I'm not sure if, but the fact that there are sustained protests, I think their economy is really in trouble. So, yeah, I don't really, I haven't taken a close look at like, what analysts think, what are the chances of them failing. But it's not like they have the situation under control and everything's going back to normal. Like their economy is very bad and the protests are continuing. So I don't think the Iranian authorities are really sitting pretty, but yeah, they have managed to hold on to power, of course,
Yeah.
for
And
now at least.
I guess I want to introduce like a segment called I like to call it Jerusalem Together. Some may argue that it should be called Tel Aviv Together, but it's about some developments that have happened in Israel. It seems, unfortunately, that the new government there is not going to be as hardline against Russia as Yair Lapid was. It seems like Netanyahu has a personal friendship with Vladimir Putin, and it doesn't seem like. And Israel also, it's important to remember that apparently Russia has been basically allowing Israel to operate in Syria, um, and so they've been more muted in their criticism as a result.
Yeah, I haven't. I probably haven't been following that situation as closely as you have, but I have seen some of the news about some of the pro-Ukrainian accounts have been talking about some of the various actions of and I think like for even prior to this new administration, Israel had not wanted to supply some of their air defense systems to Ukraine, including the ones that the U.S. helped them to develop.
Yeah, and it's a bit ironic considering that I believe Vladimir Zelensky is actually Jewish, um, and I think that there were people who were in my circle of friends who were talking about Ukraine basically getting the same guarantees from the U.S. that Israel does, which is that U.S. basically supplies weaponry and basically allows for like Ukraine to be able to defend itself without any American soldiers having to be deployed. That's the model that Israel's had, and it was thought about that Ukraine would have it too.
Yeah.
I mean, so I think honestly, I think at this point, I would be surprised if I'm not sure what's going to happen. Next development's going to be in the war. So from what I'm hearing, by the way, just back to Ukraine, it sounds like there may be an attack at Zaporizhia in order to put Crimea and Kherson under siege, or the rest of Kherson Oblast, like the left bank of the Dnieper, basically put all that under siege by basically splitting Zaporizhia and like is what I'm saying making any military sense to you?
Yeah, I haven't been following the maps really closely about like what town provides access to what area, but I did um see an article today that they think the Russians are mostly controlling kind of the remains of a salt mining town, and then there's been a lot of fighting in this eastern Donbass region.
Yeah,
Um,
the Donbass seems like it's going to be the hardest region to take back because it sounds like Russia can easily supply it, whereas right now they're not able to supply their troops in Crimea because that bridge has been blown.
yeah,
Yeah. So I figure you basically take Zaporizhia, you split the Russians in half.
yeah. So are you saying the Ukrainians are attempting to do that
I
now?
think that might be their next move.
Yeah,
They did it so successfully in Kharkiv and at Kherson, that I think if you take Melitopol, apparently Melitopol is like a rail connection to like a lot of like that southern area. So
yeah.
you
And
take
it
that.
seems like
You go ahead.
it seems oh, it seems like they have started to get some heavier weaponry. Like the U.S. and Germany were both saying they were gonna send them Patriot, missile defense systems, and finally they were gonna get some tanks. I think so. I
I'm
mean,
surprised that the United States has still not sent them the Atacms.
yeah. I mean the U.S. is like, oh, look at this. This is amazing. We're sending so much stuff, but then some of the accounts, some of the like, people tracking how much has been sent, and they're like,
And
there's still a lot that could have been sent that wasn't or hasn't
it,
yet been.
it's actually worth noting that like for people who say that this is like the US is just like sending too much, it's worth noting that everything that the countries have actually been sending Ukraine is equipment that was already going to be phased out anyway, and that they just thought it would be useful for someone to have it.
Yeah,
Yeah, they're not sending them anything new. They're sending them basically stuff that they were going to phase out anyway.
yeah,
um,
yeah. And I've also seen the comment made that like a very small percentage of the U.S. defense budget that is taking out a very large percentage of Russia's defense capabilities. So
well,
even from a purely selfish perspective of the U.S., it's a tremendous opportunity to like downgrade Russia. And I don't think that not advocating for looking at it just from a like dollars and cents to combat Russia, but for the people that are like, oh, well, why is this our battle? or whatever. It's like even objectively and selfishly, it's a very good deal that the U.S. has going.
Yeah, well, maybe we should do a small short segment called "De-seed Together" because you know that they just elected a speaker after like 4 days of votes. Apparently, one aspect of that deal is a $75 billion defense cut.
Okay, I didn't.
You didn't
I
see that?
No, I didn't see the defense cut. I thought it was non defense discretionary spending that they wanted
Okay, I don't know
cut.
why I thought it said $75 billion in defense spending that they wanted cut.
Maybe I didn't read all of the. I know there was, yeah, electing the speaker, and then there was the rules pass it.
Yeah, no, so
The elect.
this would not have been in the rules, but apparently, I mean, I'll have to look this up. Like, let's see, 75 billion. Okay, of course Twitter's not. Let me see here. Um, yeah, it looks like it's in defense spending.
Okay, that's interesting. I hadn't heard that.
Yeah, so I mean, people on Twitter have been talking about it. Yeah, no, that would be really horrible if they did that, wouldn't it?
Yeah, I don't know what percentage of the um defense bill, I mean, of the actual defense spending that is. I guess maybe it's the far right that didn't, that isn't very supportive of Ukraine. It seems like it's kind of like the far right and the far left, and then it's like everyone kind of in the middle is like, yeah, we should be supporting Ukraine.
The
But,
normies.
but the far right, the far left can be fairly pro Russia.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm not looking forward to the shenanigans that have been happening in the House. By the way, I know this is not foreign policy related, but I just wanted to take a moment to laugh at what transpired in New York's third congressional district, the shenanigans that have come out since then. You know who got elected to that district?
Is that the George Santos district?
Yes. Like, politicians lie, but I don't think I've seen anything like that before.
Yeah, it is unfortunate that there's like zero mechanism to even fact check. Although, like, if his opponent hadn't tried to make hay with that, then I mean, they kind of had a missed opportunity for Oppo research. But yeah, it kind of shows how little accountability there is. And if you're good enough, if you can just make up whatever story about yourself you want, and no one's actually going to fact check it.
Yeah. Also, while we were off, we had an instance of something happening in a couple things happening in Latin America. One of which we might cover in a segment called Lima de Together, because the president of the Peru basically tried to stage a coup, and then the government couped him.
Yeah, and then Brazil had, I think it was just a couple days ago, that
Yeah.
their former president
Segue
supporters,
Brazilian together.
um, yeah, so like chaos in Brazil and Peru. Although it seems like, at least in the Brazil situation, they did arrest the people causing the disruption.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there was also, I think, this is not going to roll off the tongue well at all. Buenos Aires together. Apparently, the vice president of Argentina is under investigation or is being arrested, or the Peronist.
Okay, I don't think I had seen
Oh,
that.
you're not familiar with Argentinian politics. Okay, so um basically they're like, for a long time Argentina was controlled by these populists called the Peronists, and the current president of Argentina is Peronist. Basically, it's a leftist kind of populist, more populist than leftist though. But this year there are elections in Argentina, and the right might actually win for the first time in quite a while.
Oh,
So
okay.
Latin America has been not been a good has been a not so great place for the conservatives.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
kind of been, yeah, it's Latin America has, I think, had a lot of political challenges. It seems like there's a lot of it's one extreme or the other in Latin America. Like, it seems like they're maybe their middle ground has broken down even more so than ours has in the US, where you just have like someone on the far right or someone on the far left. You don't have anyone in between.
Yeah. Just hopping around the world. I think we might do one more segment called Taipei together. Because I think there's a lot of people who are worried that I think there are people who are expecting that China's going to peak this year, and that therefore they may decide it's now or never to invade Taiwan.
In terms of their economic power,
Yeah,
basically.
and I guess in terms of manpower as well, because like there's been, I think the consensus was always that it'll probably be happened by like 2027 at the latest if it happens at all. But I think that's been moved up because China's economy is slowing like
Yeah, I
rapidly.
mean, I would hope that as much as Russia sort of bit off more than they could chew in Ukraine would discourage China, um, but yeah, I have no doubt that China has ill intentions. I think another, speaking of China foreign policy, another interesting phenomenon is that like most of like China is committing the genocide against the Uyghur people, who are who are Turkish and Muslim. And most of the Muslim world has actually been happy to look the other way on that. Turkey has occasionally said they don't really like it, but they don't really. I mean, they're pretty much allies with China. They don't really do much to confront it. The Taliban also decided that they could overlook such, atrocities against their fellow Muslims as long as China was useful to them economically. But ISIS in Afghanistan is not quite so understanding. So now, when ISIS is
Well,
gaining strength in
ISIS is in
Afghanistan,
Afghan. Oh yeah, ISIS is the ISIS is in Afghanistan.
yes, ISIS is in Afghanistan, and ISIS has not the last couple. Well, supposedly the reason we turned the country over to the Taliban was because the Taliban was supposed to control ISIS, which um had the Taliban's not. I mean, they have killed people. Part of what they do is they just kill people they don't like, and they call them ISIS. I mean, there is ISIS in Afghanistan, but it's also really convenient for them every time they kill someone that may have been like formerly worked for the U.S. They can just say he's an ISIS guy. Um, but ISIS is gaining strength in Afghanistan, and they are basically recruiting, saying that the Taliban is not hardline enough. And they actually a few weeks ago they pulled off. I think it was maybe only about 3 weeks ago they pulled off their like most complex attack to date. They were able to get into an area that had like high level Taliban is supposed to be highly secure, and pulled off an attack there and
This is
killed.
the
I think
rebels.
this is a ISIS. No,
Oh,
this is
okay.
not like good guy rebels. This is like this. Probably, well, the most powerful group in Afghanistan is Taliban, then probably followed by ISIS. But ISIS has been gaining strength and experience in Afghanistan. It was ISIS that is believed to have done that big attack on the hotel where Chinese nationals were staying, because ISIS does not approve of the Taliban cozying up to China, because they don't think the Taliban should be overlooking China, imprisoning Uyghur people. So basically, ISIS in Afghanistan is targeting Chinese. The Taliban is trying to get China to come and do economic deals because China is willing to give them money, and most of the rest of the world won't. But then ISIS doesn't like China, so then ISIS is targeting Chinese that are there at the Taliban's invitation. Um, and ISIS is gaining strength in Afghanistan. They don't actually control any territory yet. Um, and there also are like sort of good guy rebel groups that kind of mainly grew out of like the former Afghan government forces. So, and there's a National Resistance Front, and there's some others. And they are all they are all Muslim based groups, but the NRF is kind of like the good guy rebels. ISIS is obviously not they're like the only group that can make the Taliban look like not as bad as they are.
Right. And I'd continue on with this. It's just that for those of you looking at my face right now, I've clearly had a long day. It's actually like after 9 p.m. when we're recording this at my time. I'm thinking we should pause it there and like resume some other time. In the meantime, Kristy, where can everyone follow you? What should everyone check out? Plug everything you want.
Yeah, so you can follow me at Kristy Perano on Twitter. I we I guess kind of about helping our allies and about national security and stuff. And then also the organization that I'm actually president-elect of is Kurdish Alliance, and at Kurdish Alliance on Twitter. And we're a very small organization, completely volunteer run, but we do help a few Afghan ally families, and we've also done some humanitarian work for Kurdish and Yazidi families, as well as some cultural activities to promote Kurdish culture and understanding of Kurdish culture in the U.S. So, yeah, if anyone is interested in learning more about Kurdish issue, then they can follow Kurdish Alliance.
All right. Be sure to follow Kurdish Alliance. And Kristy, we will have you back on the show next time.